Over the years on this channel, I've featured some really nice pieces of hi-fi equipment from companies like Sony, Pioneer and Technics, amongst others. But my own personal hi-fi origins go back to something a lot more humble than that. Around about 40 years ago now, I got one of these. This was my first hi-fi. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might have spotted that this comes from AMSTRAD. Now, that might not mean very much to people in other countries, but people around about my age here in the UK who bought an AMSTRAD hi-fi in the early 1980s, they'll know exactly what it means. It means I was done over like a kipper. I was taken in by the mug's Eyeful. Now, in my defence, I was just a child at the time. I didn't know any better. But in this video, I want to talk to you about how AMSTRAD ruined things for everyone by selling things like this.
AMSTRAD Tower Systems, now with infrared remote control, £179, or with twin cassette decks and remote control, only £199. And AMSTRAD's new SM101 with motorized record deck, just £149, at these stores now.
Yeah, it was the retractable record deck that really appealed to me at the time. The idea of having it glide out, the little plastic bit move out of the way, all seemed very James Bond to a 12 or 13-year-old. I can see why I would have been drawn to that, because that's the kind of thing that still attracts me now with devices where there's some kind of ingenious mechanism going on. Another thing I can see on here, which has followed me all the way through, is flashing LEDs. I remember distinctly choosing this model over a model that had twin cassette decks, because this one had this big bank of flashing LEDs, whereas the twin cassette version covered this section over and just had a couple of LEDs in the middle. They've also got little LEDs up here on the speakers as well, which is interesting. You don't see that too often. So I could definitely see why I went for this, and also the form factor here. This system of having the record player hide away and not on top meant that I could put this away in a cupboard in my room, whereas I wouldn't have been able to fit a full system that either went on the floor in a cabinet or required you to be able to get to the top of it. So yeah, there was a number of reasons why I chose this one. But this isn't mine. This is what I bought more recently on eBay, just to make this video. Mine was thrown away a long time ago because it was crap. Now this one, when they sent it to me, the people didn't pack it very well. And you might be able to see here, we're all broken at the bottom. Yeah, it's really took a bit of a knock. You can see the laminated chipboard is actually cracked here. And I think the whole thing has just been dropped on a corner. So when I bought it, this was all intact. It all still operated. I don't think it's going to do it now. I haven't switched this thing on yet. Let's see what works. Okay, let's turn the power on. Well, we're getting something out of it. Let's just tune the radio in. We're on FM.
When watching Accrington Stanley is the Whalley Road Fish Fries, 400 yards from the Wham.
You could win £10,000 every month for 30.
Well, the LEDs are flashing there, the radio's tuning in fine. You can see the source selectors here. We've got the 3 radio bands and then the record player and the tape deck, so let's go on to that. Yeah, I'm getting nothing out of this cassette mechanism at all. It will rewind and fast forward, although it's a little bit slow at those, but the tape's playing fine. The tape has music on it. I should be able to hear it. I've got the volume turned up to maximum. There's nothing coming through. It's almost like it's being muted inside the system. I thought it might be something to do with the source selectors. If you put it into the phono mode, you can hear a buzz there. So that's being picked up through the pickup. So I think the record player might work as long as it spins. But the tape deck, complete silence. So we just have to give up on that one for the moment. Now, as far as tape decks go, well, compared to some of these modern ones, it's actually not that bad, which is saying something to how bad they've actually got. As far as the controls go here, mechanical buttons here, so it's a cheap mechanism for the time. It's not got touch controls, but inside here we do have an electronic erase head, which is something you don't see too often nowadays. And I can't test the wow and flutter, of course, even after all these years, though it would be not as good as it was when it was first made, but I bet it's better than most of those modern things. And over here we've got a button to choose between chrome, metal and normal. with this middle one's to make this show a VU display or power meter. We've got a manual recording control over here on the right, so we can control the recording level. It's not a 3-head deck though, so we can't hear what we're adjusting. We can just look at the VU meter to do that. And here we've got noise reduction. Now notice it doesn't say Dolby noise reduction, it doesn't say it on the back of the machine either. Normally they have a little thing on the back saying Dolby's licensed from blah 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 blah. Well, no, nothing. So whatever that is, it's not Dolby. And just rounding out the rest of the controls, along the top middle here we've got the standard treble, bass and balance knobs. On the right is the volume control. Next to there we've got a mono or stereo switch. That'd mostly be used in conjunction with the FM radio. If you weren't getting a good stereo signal, knock it into mono. And then loudness, if you were to activate that, you get more bass at lower volumes. And then moving over here, now I don't remember this, but it would have been on mine. I probably never used it. It was the filters for rumble and scratch, so those will be used in conjunction with a record player. So if you're getting a lot of surface noise or motor noise, you turn on the rumble, which might indicate, if that's there, that they're expecting this thing to make a lot of noise when you play records, and they put this on here to compensate for the fact it's a pretty dodgy mechanism. And then we've got the scratch filter next to there, which is just to reduce down your kind of clicks and things off a record. I don't think these would be particularly effective, but anyway, there they are. Next to their headphone output. And finally, next to the power switch, there's a combined switch here which says AFC/beat. Now, I presume if it's in, it's acting as an auto frequency control switch, and then perhaps out would be beat cut for your AM stations. Mute, that is an unusual button to have on a hi-fi. You don't tend to see that. Let's see if that record player works. Now, it's not going to come out automatically, I'm sure, because this piece of plastic is fouling the mechanism. Yeah, I seem to remember it going up, or was it down? But anyway, whichever it was supposed to do, it's not going to do it now. Proudly mentioning that it's got belt drive in here, as though that's some massive feature, but we'll get that out of the way. Let's press this button, see if it works. Oh, look. It works about as well as it did on my old one. Ah, there's the edges of the door going down into the bottom there. I think you can see that. Yeah, this was a problem with mine. I remember taking mine apart and trying to get this working, and all it was a little rubber band in the bottom of here that went round a motor. Very tiny little motor, tiny rubber band to move this whole thing on rails. It's no wonder it never moved properly, but this one's been dropped, so I can kind of forgive it that. But let's just pull this out a little bit more. Yeah, so it's got a plastic turntable. As you can see here, it's dampened on springs. Around the edge of the turntable we've got these markings which are there to mimic those of a more expensive turntable, where those would indicate the strobe. You'd be able to see if the turntable was running at the right speed. There's no light on here, and this won't work as a strobe other than this little LED, but that's just going to indicate that it's working. Over here on this side we've got a sticker with a UK patent applied for number. I'm going to have to look that up and see what that refers to. Okay, so here it is. The application was filed in 1982. You can see from the picture at the top left that that is the same piece of equipment that I have here, and there's plenty of text that goes along with the application, as well as technical drawings of the record player section. However, when you read through it, it turns out that in a nutshell they're just trying to patent the idea of a pull-out record player in a drawer. There's nothing special about the record playing mechanism itself. The one they used wasn't even made by AMSTRAD. No, they're just trying to patent the idea of it being stored in a drawer. They seem to think they've invented the concept of the drawer, a part that never worked properly. Even if you're being charitable and say, well, maybe nobody mounted a record player in a slide-out drawer before, let me draw your attention to Exhibit A, a selection of music systems dating from the 1940s with the record playing mechanism mounted on a slide-out drawer. And this is just a small selection of the ones I've found. Needless to say, the Patent Office records show that AMSTRAD's application was ultimately unsuccessful. I can't for the life of me think why. The turntable component comes from BSR, Birmingham Sound Reproducers. Now, they went bust in 1985. And you can see here that the record player is really a standalone unit, because we've got the two speeds, 45 and 33 in the third, but we've also got an off position. So it's not really controlled from the rest of the unit. The phono switch will switch over to this as a source, and then you just control this down here. This is a really lightweight plasticky tone arm, a hollow oblong piece of plastic, and there's no way to adjust anything on this, so you're just going to hope it's set up right to start with. But let's just put a record on and just put it into 33. So we'll lift that up, make sure this is on the phono mode at the top. Yeah, right, here we go. hold on. We've got a problem. I can't turn it off. Oh, did I have it? There we go. Right. Yeah, that switch has got a bit funny. It isn't working properly, obviously. It's running slow. It doesn't sound great at all. It perhaps is a worn-down stylus as well. I can't imagine anyone's put a new one in here for a long time. One thing I will say about it, though, it's a proper moving magnet cartridge, and whilst it's certainly not high-end, it's definitely a step above the kind of thing you get in a modern-day suitcase-type turntable, where you'd have a ceramic cartridge with a sapphire stylus that wears down after playing just a few records. Well, it's clear that age hasn't been kind to this, and dropping it on its corner probably didn't help its chances either, but I'm sure there's some people watching this wondering what the problem is. What's wrong with this? It looks all right. Seems to do the job. Well, let me explain. I'm going to do it with the help of this 1984 Boots catalogue from their sound and vision department that dates from around about the same era. So let's have a look at the hi-fis that are on offer in here. Here are 3 competing systems that are designed to appeal to a customer that's looking for a hi-fi in a cabinet. Starting from the left, we've got a unit from Pioneer. It looks quite basic but totally respectable with its single cassette deck and its radio and record player. But let's just move along to the middle one. We've got a Sansui here. This looks a bit more sophisticated, although it does seem to have a similar feature set. Again, it's got a single tape deck, it's got an analog radio tuner, although it looks like there might be a few more bits going on here that might light up when it's powered up. But let's move on now to the AMSTRAD on the right. Now, this one has twin cassette decks so that you can copy tapes that you borrowed from your friends, and it's also got a graphic equalizer, and above that there are some flashy LEDs. So let's look at the prices. Starting with the Pioneer, that one's £240. Now the Sansui costs quite a bit more at £350. But then the one with the most features, the AMSTRAD, well, that's the cheapest of the lot at just £200. So the typical thing that happened here is you get a young person, they're in their first job, they're saving up for a hi-fi, perhaps something along the lines of the Sansui, and then they see that AMSTRAD and they think, well, I could carry on saving up for another year, or I could just get this cheaper model now that's got more features. It was a very enticing proposition. So what's the catch? Well, it's clearly documented in this book, Alan Sugar, The AMSTRAD Story. In Chapter 5, titled A Mug's Eyeful, it details how Alan Sugar, the founder of Alan Michael Sugar Trading AMSTRAD, returned from a trip to the Far East in 1978. Over there, he'd seen how the Japanese audio companies were grouping together separate hi-fi components, the amplifier, the cassette deck and the tuner, and then selling them as a stack system. And this gave him an idea. As he put it, the wallies that ended up buying this stuff didn't even know what they were buying anyway. Once they connected all the wires up between the components, they never moved them again. So why not just make the whole thing as one unit? It would be cheaper to make because you wouldn't need to have multiple power supplies, one for each component. You could do away with all the inputs and outputs on the back. Just make it look like separate hi-fi components from the front, but put it all together in one box at the back. And he christened this idea the Tower System. To cap it all off, he made sure the front panel looked expensive, silver-coated, covered with flashing lights, buttons, knobs and dials, and he called that a Mug's Eyeful. You wouldn't find these things in stores that were proper hi-fi shops. No, they ended up alongside white goods in stores like Comet and Rumbelows, Argos and Currys. Within a few years, the market was flooded with similar products from other manufacturers. The old guard of consumer-grade hi-fis, Sony, Pioneer, Technics, they were having their lunch eaten. They struggled to compete on price because they were still trying to sell you a proper hi-fi made of proper components, not something that just looked like a hi-fi. They weren't well made, they fell apart pretty quickly, things would break on them, but just outside your warranty period. And whilst they were working, they didn't sound very good. The quality of these things was very low end. A cheap transistor radio that you bought off a market stall would sound the same as this thing. What you're actually getting is rock bottom components shoved in a hi-fi case and tarted up to look more than what it is. But the problem was at the time we didn't have the communication that we do now, so you only really found this out by buying one yourself and then regretting it, or word of mouth from people that you knew. In fact, the AMSTRAD name became synonymous with rubbish around about this point. So it took a while for the information to get through, but eventually everyone knew that AMSTRAD hi-fis were something to be avoided. But it's a little bit too late by that point because the market had been disrupted and largely destroyed as far as the middle ground goes, with companies trying to compete to get cheaper the whole middle ground of decent quality hi-fis disappeared, because you got these cheap low-end things that all the companies were racing to the bottom on, and then that left a big gap, and then you got the high-end hi-fi, but the mid-ground, the decent quality middle of the range stuff, since people weren't saving up for it anymore, they were just getting cut off before they got up to that point, that stuff kind of disappeared, and it's all Amstrad's fault, in my opinion, amongst other companies that were doing similar things at the time. But Amstrad pioneered this whole market, pioneer not being a pun there. And just to illustrate the level of buyer's remorse that existed amongst Amstrad's customers, here's a comment that I saw under one of my videos a while back. The poor chap here, he bought his Amstrad system from a comic store using a payment scheme, which at the time probably had a massive APR, and as he puts it, the speaker fronts weren't attached properly, the dual tape decks slowed down if you tried to copy a tape, and the record player didn't play at the right speed. And there's probably tens of thousands of people out there who are able to share similar stories. Amstrad's strategy, to me, a little bit like strip mining or bottom dredging, that you're making as much money as you can for yourself at the time, but you're just destroying things for everyone else. I know it's nearly 40 years later, but I do remember being disappointed in this at the time. I'm sure we've all got those memories of wanting something so badly as a present, and then when you got it, it didn't live up to the expectations. Well, this was one of those things. It just didn't sound very good at all. I'd already got a little portable radio, and this sounded roughly the same quality. The audio seems to be like compressed into the middle, very thin sounding, not a very wide frequency range. I think part of it is these speakers. I mean, just look at that, look how thin those are. And I suspect that that's a fake tweeter up there, something that we've become more used to recently. But you know what, we're going to take these apart in a minute. One thing I want to mention, you see these indicators up here? This is something that quite excited me at the time, the idea of those flashing. Well, they never did, because they're power indicators. You have to have it really loud, and by the time you turn it up loud enough for these to flash, it just sounds awful. In fact, let's try and have a go with that now. Let's just put the radio on. Right, for some reason the radio stopped tuning in now. I think it's all dying, but it doesn't matter. We're going to have a look inside it in a moment. I'll put the record player on because we know that that'll work. If it's a little bit slow, it doesn't matter. Yeah, you'd have to take it up to a level where it got distorted before you could start seeing these things doing anything. Anyway, I think that's quite enough for that. I think it's time to have a look inside this and see exactly what's in here. Right, I'm just taking these plastic sections off the side so that we can pop the drawer back inside. And I think we'll have a look inside a speaker first of all, and then we'll get inside this. I just want to show you one thing first though. Notice how it's designed to look like separate components all the way down here, but of course it's just one big chipboard box. Okay, well, I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to get in this. There's no obvious way in on the back. I don't know whether or not these screws are proper screws on the front or are just there for decoration. I suspect this front's glued to the wooden case at the back. We'll see if we can pry those two halves apart. But yeah, that's not doing anything. I'll take these bottom ones out as well, see if they do anything. No, those are just plastic moulding. Those aren't even real screws. The hex screwdriver's just stripping those down to the plastic. Yeah, it's plastic that's been painted. Okay, well, it looks like we're going to have to peel this front off, so let's have a go at that. Yeah, I can feel it moving. It's very old glue now, of course, so it's not going to open easily. We're not going to be putting this back together again, so it doesn't matter if we snap a few pieces. Right, we're in. No, it was just glued. And there we go, that's the inside of that. AMSTRAD SP1616A, maximum 8 watts, 4 ohm. And we've got the speaker there wired up to the little LED thing at the top. And our fake tweeter grill. That's what's in the back of there. Now, I'm no loudspeaker expert, but don't they put stuff in them normally? You know, like sort of baffling type of things, and of course bass ports and all that. Maybe that came later than this, but I'm sure you're supposed to fill them with stuff, aren't you? Like fluff? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, there you go, that's what's in the speaker. So, let's move on and have a look inside the main unit. Now, before I start, I just want to show you a couple of things on the back here. First off, we were quite capable of making our own rubbish back in the day. And then these are the only inputs and outputs on the back panel. We've got the power lead, the FM aerial, and then the speaker plugs. Notice there's no auxiliary input. So this device has no upgrade path. You're restricted to using the built-in components, the tape, the record and the radio. You can plug a couple of microphones into this, but if you wanted to plug in one of those newfangled compact disc players, well, you're stuffed. And now I think about it, that might have been a good thing, because if somebody had one of these and then decided that they did want to start playing compact discs, they'd have to get rid of this. So CD to the rescue. Hopefully the next thing they bought was a lot better. Okay, this is the last screw, and with just 3 on either side, it feels like this front section is now coming loose. So let's see if it just comes away from the rest of the case. I think, yeah, there we go. Seems to be clipped behind there. Oops, right, we're out. Okay. As you'd imagine, there's not an awful lot going on in here. There's a couple of plugs that I can detach because this part is going underneath this bit of chipboard and down to the record player. So I'll just separate the two halves and hopefully we can then have a look at the front panel. Okay, well that's separated, so I'll just move it to one side. We'll have a look at that in a moment. Let's get the record player out of here. This should lift off now, I think. There we go. Right, so I've spun this component around and you're looking at it from the back. So you can see here how it moves up and down along this toothed rail. And the little motor that does that, which was way underpowered for what it needed to be, is just there. Because this thing weighs quite a bit really. And it was all being driven through a rubber belt that was pulling this thing along this toothed wheel, and this is the bit that I remember falling off with mine and having to fish inside the back and try and put that back on there, and as soon as I'd done it, it'd fall off again. It was a very poor design and badly thought out. So let's get that out of the way and have a look at the rest of it. Right, so there we go. That is our hi-fi, and as you can see, it really is just a cheap set of components stuck to a bit of plastic sprayed silver to look like something that's a little bit more exciting than it is. One thing noticeable on here is the lack of chips. Of course, it is the early 1980s, but it's a very old-fashioned kind of construction. Really basic, really cheap. Hardly takes up any room at all. I mean, just look at that. It's just the front panel, and then with a big wooden box shoved behind it to get the gullible mugs to buy it, people like me. When you look at this front panel, it really tells you everything that you need to know about AMSTRAD music systems from this period. They spent all the budget here to sucker people like me into buying something that looks better than it is. But if you look behind that, literally, you can see that you're just buying some very low-end components that have been slung together. A little bit like pulling back the curtain on The Wizard of Oz. It's a lot less impressive back here than you thought it might be. So the next time you hear someone going on about cheaply made Chinese rubbish, just remember that it wasn't an idea that originated there. We were making things like this here in the UK 40 years ago. Something to be proud of. That said, a lot of the components in the modern devices, they're worse than the things in this. I'm sure when they spec this out, they got some of the cheapest things they possibly could in the early 80s, and yet they're still better than things you can get nowadays, like the cassette deck. That is a better mechanism than you'd find in most things nowadays. The record player, proper moving magnet cartridge, dampened springs, yeah, very low end, but still a lot better than you might see in some budget devices now. It's a shame that we're still falling for the Mugs Eyeful after all these years, because whilst these modern day devices like a briefcase record player or an all-in-one hi-fi are awful, they do what they say they're going to do, just like this thing. They perform the functions that it says it will on the box. It just does it to such a low level that they're more than likely to kill off any interest that someone might have in that than nurture it. By that I mean, if you get a child, they get their first record player, a bit like me, they get something like this. Well, if that first record player is just rubbish, they'll soon lose interest and they'll move on to other things, which is a bit of a shame. With me, this was the last hi-fi that I had, well, hi-fi for many years. Towards the end of the 80s, I got myself a boombox, and that was the first time after this that I ever listened to music again through speakers rather than just through headphones. I had my Walkman, which sounded like a million times better than this, so that's pretty much what I used. And then when I got my boombox, that sounded a lot better, and that's when I really started getting more interest in music again. But this thing, this nearly killed off any interest I had. From the early 80s to the late 80s, I had this in the room, it never got switched on, it was just so bad. Well, I've still got one speaker left, so that'll come in handy on bonfire night. But I just want to finish this video off with a little bit of a message, because the other reason I got this original hi-fi back in the early to mid 1980s was because I didn't know any better. I had no knowledge about these things. I was only a child. My parents weren't into this stuff at all. There was nobody around me who could pass on their experience and say, look, you really don't want to get that because it's rubbish. And maybe it's our responsibility as people who've been through all this kind of stuff to help pass on our knowledge to the younger generation. Kids nowadays who, for Christmas or their birthday, they want one of these little briefcase record players. You can maybe say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll go shopping. We'll see if we can find something a little bit better. Maybe try and contribute towards it a little bit. Just point them in the right direction. It might encourage an interest in something that will blossom into something later on that really otherwise, if they'd have got that briefcase record player, they'd have played with it for a couple of months, lost interest and moved on to something else. So yeah, if you can help somebody out, help them make the right decision, try. If they don't want to take up your advice, fair enough, but at least you made the effort. That's all I want to say. So that's it for the moment. As always, thanks for watching.